And here we are. Um, Chapter 4, Fiction of Forgiveness. Edgar dies of the virus. This is all true. My friend, actually, it's my friend Stu Cohen. I used the name Edgar Weinstein, um, but it's about my friend Stu. My friend Stu actually died of COVID. Very, very good friend of mine for many years. Fellow Buddhist. He claims I introduced him to Buddhism. It wasn't quite true, but I did always supported him in becoming a Buddhist. And I remember, since we're on the topic of Stu, um, Stu was somebody that I thought was among the most intelligent people that I'd ever met. He was certainly among the most well-read people that I had ever met. Stuart would go, and someone would be throwing out an apartment full of books, and Stu would take them all and read them all, and then he'd donate them to the senior center or something like that. But Stuart was someone learning for learning's sake, just being in the know. Stuart was an amazing person, and he was like, he was a big supporter of mine, and even through the changes in my life around 2001, I moved in with Stu after my wife at that time in Western Mass asked me to leave. And I offered to go down to Springfield to get a job down there. But she said, "Not too close." And I'll go back to New York. Okay, went back to New York. It was like an epiphany. I was so happy on some level to have gone back to New York. But over the years, Stuart, as bright a person as he was and loyal, Stuart was. I'm just going to say Stuart was. He was an eccentric, but a lovely, wonderful eccentric, and one of maybe my closest friend. So go figure. Anyway, chapter 4, Edgar dies of the virus. Wyatt's friend just died this past week of the coronavirus. Edgar Weinstein was in a nursing home in Canarsie, Brooklyn, trying to get whatever he needed to be able to walk again. His health had been slipping for years, quite honestly, and Wyatt had told himself on at least 3 separate occasions that Eddie was headed down the path of certain death. He had stopped walking several months before, complications of heart issues and something vascular. Wyatt didn't know what he meant by this before, but Eddie's landlady said he had some veins in his legs that opened up and wouldn't heal properly. So one of the things he was going to have done was to laser up the veins so he would stop leaking. Such a Coney Island story, I'll tell you. Wyatt had lived with Weinstein, though he hadn't since his second marriage broke down in 2002. Wyatt's ex had urged him to consider heading back to New York City to give space to their interactions that had devolved to the point of spawning more hurt and pain than love and joy. It was to be a modern relationship, with the husband working in New York City and returning home to upstate New York, Western Mass. On the weekends, in truth, it was a veiled, escalating separation that could only lead to divorce. That's chapter 4. I'm just going to go on to chapter 5. Chapter 5, Unpacking a 20-year marriage. It's not a related theme. Fast forward a year or so after Wyatt had gotten into the routine of spending the week in Brooklyn, living in the shared rental on West 21st Street, and getting up very early on a Saturday around 5 o'clock and pointing his 1975 BMW northward. He would drive the 175 miles to the Catskills, where his wife was still living on a dusty lane in a teeny rented shack of a farmhouse on 10 acres of land. He'd get there in 3.5 hours, and by 9 a.m., he'd be firing up the AMC mini seated lawnmower and cutting a couple acres of grass. He'd sleep over in a tent in the middle of the field. Wyatt realized he wasn't much more than a free grass cutting service. Something should have told him his wife was out of his life was out of kilter, out of whack in the realm of obvious and growing alienation from his wife. But a few months he would come up for a few months he would come up to play the charade of the non-standard husband of a non-standard wife in a doomed non-standard marriage hell bent on standard run-of-the-mill divorce. Why not come back up every other weekend? She offered strategically. He took her up on it. Chapter 6. Don't answer that phone. That's the title. After a few months, she said, maybe you should skip 2 weeks and come back every third one. Wyatt knew exactly what she meant by this, and it even sounded okay to him. He knew something had to give, something had to change. She was in therapy with a woman who once called the house, and he made the mistake of picking up the receiver. There was an uncomfortable pause on the other end. It seemed like 5, 10 seconds, maybe longer. He knew this was more than likely her shrink. It felt like he had accidentally wound up on the phone with the hitman who was gunning for him. It was clear to him that this psychologist was out to facilitate the end of the marriage. He felt effectively destitute, although he suspected inwardly that it was the inevitable course of action. Naively, he had believed that shrinks were supposed to heal relationships, not engineer their demise. And yet, isn't that the age old question? Notwithstanding till death do us part, when the suffering won't subside, it's probably time to try something else. But that time of life wasn't all bad. Those trips upstate on a Saturday in the early fall of 2001 marked a lovely juxtaposition with living the week in Brooklyn with eccentric lifelong friend Eddie, who once told him that he should rest assured living in his spare room, that he would not kill him because he, quote, had family connections upstate, end quote, adding, quote, if you were a drifter, it would be a very different story, end quote. On that note, Wyatt learned to wedge a chair under his doorknob every night, just in case his friend decided to renege on his agreement not to murder him in his sleep. As fate would have it, Wyatt wrote Weinstein's eulogy, not the other way around, dying as his Brooklynite friend did of coronavirus in early April of 2020.